Star Wars was a popular movie. A sequel was inevitable. And when audiences in 1980 first entered the movie theater to see that sequel, they saw something unusual. What everyone assumed would be the second chapter of the Star Wars Saga was, for some reason, being called Episode 5? That didn't make any sense. It had only been 3 years since the first one, and the only new Star Wars stories that had come out since then were a few novels, a Marvel comic series, and a notorious holiday special. Were some of those supposed to be Star Wars 2, 3, and 4? No. As audiences would discover when the first Star Wars movie was re-released into theaters in 1981, the film had been retroactively titled Episode 4, A New Hope. And with the cliffhanger ending of The Empire Strikes Back, not only was Episode 6 assured, but seemingly, so were 3 additional movies detailing the backstory of Ben Kenobi and Darth Vader. It seems that George Lucas had a plan, but what was it? When he first started to write down ideas for his then untitled Star Wars sequel in the summer of 1977, Lucas drafted a rough timeline of the universe he created and now had the opportunity to explore. In this early version of the saga, the Star Wars trilogy occupied episodes 6 through 8, and the Clone Wars trilogy, episodes 2 through 4, were bookended by standalone prelude and epilogue films. In the end, though, he eliminated 2 of those movies, and the Star Wars trilogy became episodes 4 through 6, with a trilogy of prequels remaining in the back of his mind. And with the early history of Darth Vader becoming a complicated part of the narrative in the latter 2 films, Lucas had to figure out what that history actually was. So, as he devised the stories of The Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi, he also developed what would become the backbone of the prequels. But it would take another 20 years to see those stories actually brought to life. The realities of making a trilogy of complex, massively popular films affected Lucas both personally and professionally. The Empire Strikes Back had totally burned him out, so his sequel trilogy ideas about Luke Skywalker meeting his long-lost sister and eventually defeating the Emperor in Episode 9 were crammed into Return of the Jedi so he could finish his story and take a break. But what if he didn't take a break from Star Wars? What if, after making Return of the Jedi, George Lucas didn't move on to projects like Labyrinth, Willow, and Howard the Duck, and instead jumped right back into the galaxy far, far away and made his Star Wars prequels? What if The Phantom Menace came out in 1987? Why 1987? Well, there's a few reasons. The first is that while each film in the original trilogy was released 3 years apart, Lucas took an extra year to develop the first one, jotting down his first ideas in 1973. And with Episode 1 being removed from the original trilogy by several decades, it might also take some extra time to figure out how the setting would be different this time around. And this did end up happening with the real movie. Lucas started writing it in November 1994, and it was finally released in May 1999. The second reason for choosing 1987 as our alternate year of release would be George Lucas's ongoing divorce. He and his ex-wife Marcia, who was an editor on the original Star Wars movie, announced their divorce in 1983, with the settlement being finalized in 1987. And while the details have remained sealed since then, it's been rumored that she received somewhere between $35 and $50 million. Maybe in our hypothetical world, Lucas anticipated the costly settlement and decided that another Star Wars movie could help to recoup those losses. Or maybe our version of Lucas just decided to lean into his workaholic tendencies in order to distract himself from this major change in his personal life. The third reason for choosing 1987 is because it would have been the 10th anniversary of the original Star Wars film. Releasing the first installment of a new trilogy in the year of that anniversary seems like a good marketing move, and the special editions took advantage of a similar milestone. So with all that in mind, we've set our release schedule for the prequels. Episode 1 comes out on the traditional late May release date of May 22nd, 1987. Episode 2 is released on May 25th, 1990, and the prequel trilogy wraps up with Episode 3 on May 18th, 1993. Now all we need to do is figure out what's actually in the movie. I think the basic plot could be the same, since The Phantom Menace as it exists already draws very heavily on Lucas's early story synopsis for A New Hope. In that version, an older general is tasked with helping the young princess of an embattled world escape her home and seek safety in a friendly star system, with the princess disguising herself as a commoner along the way. As they escape the planet, their ship is attacked and they're forced to make an emergency landing on a foreign world. The general and the princess are also forced to take refuge with a group of rebel boys who end up joining them on their journey. Finally, in order to secure the princess's safety, the general and his band of young rebels must then ally with a society of seemingly primitive aliens, and their eventual victory is celebrated with a lavish parade. And when you're trying to tell the story before Star Wars, it makes a certain amount of sense to revisit what was literally the story before Star Wars. Plus, with everything else going on in Lucas's life at the time, maybe he would have leaned even harder into those ideas that he'd already had, since he wouldn't have had a couple of decades to come up with any new ones. But would Lucas have spearheaded these movies as writer and director like he eventually would in the real world? If this is the early 80s running on fumes Lucas, I think it's entirely possible and maybe even highly likely that he would have just kept the producer role he had on Empire and Jedi and let other writers and directors help to develop the new movies. But the problem with that is we have no idea who those people would have been or what ideas they would have brought to the table. And thanks to Lucas severing his ties with the Directors Guild of America in 1980, any big-name union directors would be out of the running. So, unfortunately, those anonymous other contributors were going to have to be me. And because I'm trying to turn a bunch of off-the-cuff discussions and half-thought-out ideas from over 40 years ago into a movie, this hypothetical version of Episode 1 is going to have a fair amount of speculation and, let's face it, fan fiction. I don't want this to be just a some guy rewrites the prequels thing though, so as I run through this new story for Episode 1, I'm going to be stopping fairly frequently to explain why I'm changing something or not changing something, and where I'm getting a particular idea from. And since that might impact the flow of the actual story being told, you can find a link in the description to a second video that has just the story synopsis of this alternate Episode 1. And because this is a video, we should be able to see what this hypothetical story might actually look like, right? So, with resources provided by the SWTOR Slicers community, I ripped a bunch of models from the Old Republic, pulled them into Blender, and made some concept frames to go along with the story. Where possible, I've tried to embrace the spirit of what I think could have appeared in the movie using the game's assets. For example, rather than the robed monk look for the Jedi that ended up in the film, George Lucas initially wanted them to appear more armored, using Mad Mardigan from Willow as a point of reference. And despite Mad Mardigan's double-braided hairstyle evolving into the Padawan braid Obi-Wan wears in the final movie, the Jedi design as a whole eventually shifted to something more reminiscent of Ben Kenobi's look in the original Star Wars film as a way to connect the two versions of the character together in the audience's minds. But because Willow probably doesn't exist in the world where our movie was made, Lucas may have been more willing to lean into the knight aspects of the Jedi Knights without it feeling like a retread, so our version of Obi-Wan is slightly more armored while still retaining some elements of Ben Kenobi's classic look. So with all that out of the way, let's take a look at what might have happened a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. Rather than the movie opening with Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan boarding the Trade Federation ship, I think the film could start with Obi-Wan and Mace Windu arriving at a space station to oversee the delivery of fusion portables on behalf of the Republic. This is kind of a weird departure, but there is a reason for it. Even before George Lucas wrote his full story synopsis, he scribbled down some character names and other world-building details using a journal entry as a framing device. This entry in the Journal of the Wills was written by a Jedi who had been the apprentice to a powerful warrior named Mace Windu. The name Qui-Gon didn't enter the picture until much later, specifically not until the second act of the Phantom Menace's first draft, when the characters finally reached Coruscant after their adventure on Tatooine. In that version of the story, Obi-Wan was sent to negotiate with the Trade Federation alone, and he was the one who met Jar Jar, rescued the Queen, found Anakin, and fought Darth Maul in the desert. But during those opening moments of the film, George Lucas felt that Obi-Wan needed someone to talk to, so he moved Qui-Gon up in the story and had him accompany Obi-Wan on the mission. And Qui-Gon's role eventually grew and grew until he eventually replaced Obi-Wan for most of the movie. But because Qui-Gon doesn't exist yet, the Jedi accompanying Obi-Wan will be Mace instead, who won't have a purple lightsaber because he wouldn't have been played by Sam Jackson in 1987. As for the mission itself being different, that also comes directly from the Journal of the Wills, which reads, "It was 4 years later that our greatest adventure began. We were guardians on a shipment of fusion portables to Yavin, when we were summoned to the desolate second planet of Yoshiro by a mysterious courier from the chairman of the Alliance. So, let's continue to use the stories before Star Wars to tell the story before Star Wars. Obi-Wan and Mace are Jedi Knights, babysitting a shipment of fusion portables to some outpost in the middle of nowhere when their uneventful mission is suddenly disrupted by a courier who's arrived at the station and sees their laser swords. He tells them that he's from the planet Aqual, and that his world has been blockaded by the Trade Federation in an attempt to extort control of their chrome factories. Their communications have been disrupted for months, and he's the only courier to have survived the blockade. So we've got a couple more changes here. Instead of Naboo, we have Aqual. Aqual was the name of the planet in peril from Lucas's early story synopsis, and when it was elaborated on in his rough draft script, its chrome industry became an important part of the universe, with Aquilian chrome being used in everything from weapons to droids to furniture, and the allegiance of Aqual's chrome companies became a driving force in the story as well, once the Empire blockaded the planet. And with chrome being a major part of Naboo's technological aesthetic, I think it's safe to say that the planet is a direct descendant of Aqual from those old drafts. And because we're not allowing for an extra decade of Lucas coming up with Star Wars sounding planet names, we can continue to call it Aqual. Back to the story. So we've got this courier breathlessly asking the Jedi to help rescue their queen before she's forced to sign over control of the planet, and being Jedi, of course they accept. Having something better to do than guard fusion portables doesn't hurt either. The courier has a shuttle docked on the station that he used to sneak past Aqual's blockade, but before they can reach it, he's killed by someone wielding a red laser sword. A masked Sith Knight. A battle with a Sith within the opening moments of the movie was something that was featured in both the rough and second drafts of A New Hope, so let's reuse it here. And our version of the Sith seems a lot more like Darth Vader than Darth Maul, doesn't he? During the development of A New Hope, 3 Sith Lords, including Vader, were going to be featured in the movie at one point, and concept art for the second Sith Lord by costume designer John Mollo actually exists, and he looks just like Vader. So rather than every Sith having their own unique Hot Topic aesthetic, Vader's outfit was, at the time, just what they wore, with Vader having modifications to suit his particular injuries. So the Vader-esque Sith Knight battles Obi-Wan and Mace through the corridors of the space station and manages to injure the older Jedi. Obi-Wan, being brash and reckless, attempts to fight the Sith on his own, hopefully giving Mace a chance to escape back to the Republic hangar. It's clear that Obi-Wan is no match for the Sith's power alone, so he flees to the courier's shuttle in the nick of time and blasts off into space. As I mentioned before, in the real Episode 1, Qui-Gon basically stole Obi-Wan's role in the movie, but in this version of the story, made much closer to the end of the original trilogy and with less distance from its characters, I think that George Lucas might have been more conscious of keeping the story focused on Obi-Wan. So even though Mace is there at the beginning to give Obi-Wan someone to talk to in the opening scenes, this particular scenario gives us a way to separate them so that Obi-Wan doesn't become overshadowed. And when he arrives at Aqual, Obi-Wan sees what the courier was saying is true, and he comes face to face with a blockade of the Federation's saucer-shaped Star Destroyers. When Episode 1 was in early development, Star Destroyer was the term that was used while designing the Trade Federation's battleship, so I think we can keep using it here. And the saucer shape came directly from George Lucas, and I think that if we're retaining the Trade Federation as a whole, we can also retain their saucer ships, because, well, the Trade Federation is just one big Star Trek joke. According to George Lucas in an interview with Seth MacFarlane, during the production of the first Star Wars movie, he ran into William Shatner at a bar. When Lucas mentioned he was in the middle of making a science fiction movie, Shatner asked Lucas to name a character after him. And in the end, he almost did, because when he was starting to develop the villains of his first Star Wars prequel, a group of creatures who were part of a federation and flew around in ships with prominent saucer designs, Lucas briefly decided to call them the Shatnerians. Maybe this would have been too on the nose though, and the creatures ended up being called the Nemoidians instead. This Star Trek reference ended up extending to the battle droids as well. The security droids who get wiped out by Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon are robotic red shirts, the droid commanders are painted yellow, and the crew on the Federation ship's bridge are decked out in blue. So looking at all these things together, I think it's likely that if we're going to include a Trade Federation in this alternate prequel, then Lucas could still recall his encounter with Shatner, and the Star Trek references can appear as well. And I think we should include the Trade Federation because the actions of these sorts of companies, of power and transport guilds and galactic trade unions, are all heavily featured in the backstory of the early, more politically focused drafts of A New Hope. The early drafts of The Empire Strikes Back also made Han Solo's stepfather, the head of the galaxy's transport guild, the third most powerful man in the galaxy, after the Emperor and Darth Vader. Lucas also had his own personal conflicts with unions that could have shaped his decision to make such a group the villain of the movie. When The Empire Strikes Back was released, Lucas was fined by the Directors Guild of America for not including a credit for director Irvin Kershner at the beginning of the film. See, the Guild viewed the Lucasfilm production card at the beginning of the movie as a credit for Lucas himself as a producer, and their rules required that if anyone was going to get credited at the beginning of a film, the director had to be among them. This annoyed Lucas enough that he quit the Directors Guild entirely, which meant that Return of the Jedi and the 3 prequels were all non-union productions. This led to things like Lucas hiring Richard Marquand to direct Return of the Jedi rather than the long-rumored Steven Spielberg, and Gary Oldman dropping out of the role of General Grievous because he didn't want to break union rules. Lucas's beef with unions also led to him building Skywalker Ranch in Marin County north of San Francisco rather than in Los Angeles, since being further from Hollywood itself would afford him more autonomy from its unions. This eventually resulted in Lucas filing a complaint with the National Labor Relations Board in 2005 when the local union representing the ranch's sound editors pursued a new contract that would have allowed them to more easily transfer their healthcare benefits across the country. And what all this means for our story is that when Obi-Wan reaches Aqual, he does encounter a Trade Federation blockade, and that's where we first meet our villains. While the ship itself will be crewed by droids, their leaders, the venal, capitalistic Shatnerians, would be shriveled, shrunken creatures, likely depicted using Skeksis-like puppets rather than people in costumes. The Neimoidians from the real movie only look like they do because the filmmakers realized the budget wouldn't support the initially proposed CGI versions of the characters and came up with the current design as a workaround inspired by one of the aliens from the Cantina. In the 1980s, these creatures probably would have been planned as puppets from the outset and could probably have stayed that way. So the Shatnerian Viceroy is alerted to Obi-Wan's shuttle incoming and that its markings match the shuttle that had previously made it past the blockade. He orders the ship shot down, and as it careens towards the planet's surface, he contacts the Sith Knight who confronted Obi-Wan and Mace aboard the space station. He chastises the Dark Warrior for failing to track down the ship that made it past their blockade, and boasts that he managed to do the Sith's job for him. When the Viceroy warns the Knight that one more mistake like this will end their partnership, he begins to gasp and choke as the Sith reminds him that their partnership ends when his master deems it so, and the mistake was the Federation letting a ship past the blockade in the first place. The Sith disconnects, and the Shatnerian Viceroy lashes out, telling the droids to prepare his shuttle to the surface so he can enjoy the spoils of his imminent victory. On the surface, Obi-Wan crashes the courier's shuttle into the wilds of Aqual, but once he's actually on the planet, who does he encounter? Would a version of Episode 1 made in the 80s include Jar Jar Binks, played by Michael Jackson? Probably not. While George Lucas isn't afraid of reusing older ideas, the primitive Gungans aiding in the fight against the Trade Federation might be too close too soon to Return of the Jedi's Ewoks, who themselves were a modification of a Wookiee tribe Lucas originally wanted to include in A New Hope. The Gungans were also an opportunity for Lucas to experiment with digital characters, something that wouldn't have been as likely in the mid-1980s. So while we can safely say goodbye to Jar Jar in this version of the movie, Obi-Wan would still have to encounter someone on his way to save the planet. Remember, Lucas likes to make sure characters have someone to talk to. So when Obi-Wan crash lands in the jungles of Aqual, he can be pulled from the wreck by a 10-year-old boy, Anakin Skywalker. And even though we don't have Jar Jar, I think including a younger Anakin is still likely. The early drafts of A New Hope had included younger brothers for both Luke and Leia, so George Lucas had been thinking about including child characters for a while, and I think that the 10-year time jump between episodes 1 and 2 would have still happened as well. See, when Lucas got around to making the prequels in real life, we didn't get the Clone Wars trilogy from his old notes. Instead, we got 2 Clone Wars movies and the Prelude film, something that I don't think would have changed if he'd made the movies earlier. And while Anakin could be older in Episode 1, one of the things that Lucas was trying to achieve with the real movie was to show the character at his most innocent. A broody teenage Anakin might have been cooler, but the point of the prequels was to show how a good person becomes evil, not how a bad person becomes worse. So we stick with child Anakin, who pulls Obi-Wan from the wreckage of the crashed starship. Obi-Wan doesn't have time to thank him though, because the crash also draws the attention of a battle droid patrol. Revealing himself to be a Jedi Knight, Obi-Wan destroys the droids and returns the favor by saving Anakin's life. So, battle droids. Like the Trade Federation, I think battle droids would also have existed in some form. When concept artist Doug Chiang was first brought aboard the movie, the original brief for the battle droids was that they would be the robotic precursors to the stormtroopers, and Chiang's early art depicts a robot that looks very much like that. Combined with the Trade Federation battleships being known as Star Destroyers during development, the droid starfighters being designed to resemble TIE fighter ancestors, and a conversation Lucas had with Steven Spielberg in the film's making-of documentary.
Oh,
this is our new Stormtrooper.
But in a way, he's the old model, replaced by Star Wars being the new Stormtrooper.
Yeah, because
it seems that, at the time, the Trade Federation's assets were intended to become the basis of the Empire's weaponry, rather than an enemy for them to fight. Which means we start with battle droids, who are easily dispatched by a single Jedi. Once the boy is safe, Anakin starts digging through the wreck for usable parts, which prompts some questions from Obi-Wan. Anakin tells the Jedi that he's an orphan. His family was killed when the Trade Federation arrived, but now he's joined the Resistance and came to salvage the wreck when they saw his ship crashing. Obi-Wan wonders what sort of resistance would send a young boy out into a dangerous situation alone and asks if he can meet its leaders. At the very least, maybe they can help him reach the planet's capital. Anakin eagerly leads Obi-Wan through the jungle, guiding him past the traps set up by the Resistance around their base in an abandoned temple. Once they reach the makeshift hideout, Obi-Wan realizes that this Resistance is nothing more than a bunch of young boys, war orphans like Anakin, and none of them are older than 15 or 16 years old. This sequence of events, an encounter with a native of the planet who then takes the Jedi to see the rest of his people, is something that broadly happens in the real Phantom Menace, but because we're not doing Gungans, we need something to replace them, and for that, we can go back to the source material. I mentioned earlier that the first story synopsis of A New Hope featured the protagonists taking refuge with a group of rebel boys who have set up camp in an abandoned temple, and I think that we can revisit that idea here. Not only does it let us have an approximation of the Gungans that isn't a complete retread of the Ewoks, it also gives us a natural way to introduce a couple of important younger characters, Anakin Skywalker and Owen Lars. Rather than being a resident of Tatooine, Owen is the leader of the rebel boys and the oldest by maybe a year. Owen is annoyed by Anakin's pestering about Obi-Wan's heroism, but eventually he relents enough to let the Jedi in on his gang's plan. They've managed to get a hold of an old speeder and have been modifying it into a makeshift tank using scavenged parts. They've located a Trade Federation landing site and they're going to attack it to avenge their families, which is also the plan the rebel boys had in the original story synopsis. Kenobi cautions them against this. They're just kids, though he's not much older than they are, and they're going to get themselves killed. But when he tells them to go home, they remind him they don't have one anymore. So, still a little shaken from the crash, Obi-Wan stays with the group for a meal and some rest, regaling the boys with a story from one of his Jedi adventures. The boys hang on his every word, so Obi-Wan has to catch himself and try to downplay his heroics to keep them from getting any ideas. In the early hours of the morning, the Jedi tries to sabotage the group's speeder before sneaking off to the capital, but the noise wakes Anakin, who was asleep in the back because he feels like the other boys don't really want him around. Nevertheless, Anakin is worried for the safety of his new brothers and shows Obi-Wan how to disable the makeshift tank. After all, if one of the greatest warriors in the universe thinks they're going to fail, then it must be true, and he doesn't want his friends to get hurt. Obi-Wan is touched by Anakin's praise and thanks him for his help, before disappearing into the forest. And as Kenobi trudges through the jungle, he becomes suspicious of movement and sounds all around him. After a tense moment, one by one the boys reveal themselves to have been following him. They pledge themselves to him as Padawans and ask him to help them drive the Trade Federation from their home. Obi-Wan tries to argue with them, but they chatter insistently and excitedly, drawing another sound from the jungle. This one isn't another group of rebel boys, though. It's an immense, hungry creature. Obi-Wan tries to fend the beast off by himself, but the boys have laid traps throughout the area around their hideout, and only together are they able to defeat the creature, which is another element with origins in the first Star Wars story synopsis. So reluctantly, Obi-Wan accepts that this disheveled group of rebel children may actually be cunning enough to help him, and at the very least, he now owes them his protection. Together, the group is able to reach the capital city of Aqual, and the boys use their knowledge of the backstreets to sneak past the battle droids and distract them, while Obi-Wan rescues the queen as she's being taken from the palace. A queen that he's exasperated to discover is also only 14 years old. If we're going to draw from the older drafts of Star Wars for the basic plot of the movie as Lucas did in real life, then it makes sense to make the Queen the same age as Leia was in the rough draft of A New Hope, 14 years old. It's an age that's young enough to not make her later relationship with Anakin too weird, but also old enough to be able to cast an actor who can carry themselves in important scenes with older characters. And the Queen of Aqual will also need a name. In the prequels as we know them, she's called Padme, a word taken from a Sanskrit Buddhist mantra. Lucas identifies as a
Methodist Buddhist,
and various international flavors of spiritualism were incorporated into the original trilogy, so it's not unlikely that he'd have encountered the word back in the 80s, but our version of the movie is made by a George Lucas who's in the middle of a divorce and is trying to keep his company afloat. The decision to make a new Star Wars movie as a financial contingency could mean that the philosophy of Buddhist non-attachment may not have been something that he was actively thinking about at the time, so Padme might need a different name. And we have a few different options for that name if we're drawing from Lucas's old notes and ideas. She might be named Yuki, after the character from the Hidden Fortress that she's based on. She might be named Zara, which was Leia's name in the first draft of A New Hope. She could be named Nelith, which was an early name for Luke's long-lost sister in The Empire Strikes Back, but I think we can use the name Breha. Breha was the name of Leia's mother, the Queen of Aqual, in the rough draft of A New Hope, and it was also the name eventually given to Bail Organa's wife in Revenge of the Sith. So it makes sense to give the name to Leia's mother here as well. But whatever her name, Obi-Wan is forced to deal with the teenage queen, who is expecting more help from the Republic. He tells her that her courier was killed shortly after meeting him, but that another Jedi has gone to the Republic capital to report what's happening. The feisty girl says that's not good enough, and orders Obi-Wan to help her escape the planet so she can bring her plight to the Republic directly. The slightly older Jedi humors the headstrong young queen and asks how she plans on getting past the blockade. She doesn't really know, but when the boys return with some stolen clothes for the queen to disguise herself with, they offer a suggestion: the Trade Federation landing zone they were going to attack. If they can steal a Federation ship, they could probably bypass the blockade with ease. It's a dangerous plan, but so is staying on Aqual and hoping the Republic comes to save them. So, returning to the boys' camp, Breha adopts her civilian identity while Anakin and Owen help Obi-Wan repair the sabotaged vehicle. Then, moving the speeder to the edge of the Trade Federation's landing zone, they put the vehicle in gear and the group races around to the other side of the clearing as the droids guarding the ship move to investigate. Suddenly, the speeder explodes, giving Obi-Wan, the boys, and Breha a chance to board the Trade Federation ship and leave the planet's surface. And because this plan of stealing a ship to bypass a blockade is from A New Hope's early story synopsis, we can also borrow the complication that follows when a patrol craft hails the stolen vessel. Obi-Wan tries to bluff his way past the patrol, even attempting a Jedi mind trick, but his power is useless against the robotic pilot of the ship, and he's forced to make a break for it. Also, as in the early Star Wars outline, Obi-Wan yells for the boys to man the gun turrets as the blockade fires on the stolen vessel. But despite their earlier bravado, they've never actually been in a battle before and don't know what to do. So the Jedi abandons the cockpit to try to whip the boys into shape, leaving the controls unattended, until Anakin hops into the pilot's seat to keep the ship moving. Flak from the Trade Federation blockade explodes all around them as Obi-Wan shouts half-understood orders at the boys, and Anakin desperately tries to keep the ship in one piece. The vessel takes a hit, and the incessant beeping of the ship's onboard astromech R2-D2 is added to the chaos as it tries desperately to put out fires and repair what damage it can. So, like in the real Episode 1, R2 enters the film as an ordinary repair droid, though in our version, he's the property of the Trade Federation. And this isn't exactly new. In the rough draft of A New Hope, R2-D2 and C-3PO are introduced as Imperial droids working aboard the Death Star, and they abandon the station when it comes under attack at the beginning of the film. And in the earlier story synopsis, the droids' role in the film was filled by two Imperial bureaucrats, who themselves were inspired by the two bickering peasant characters from the Hidden Fortress. So with Episode 1 using the story before Star Wars to tell the story before Star Wars, I think it's appropriate to give R2 an origin that harkens back to those original ideas. So with R2's repair skills, Anakin's piloting, and Obi-Wan's direction, the group is able to come together against all odds, and the stolen ship clears the blockade and jumps safely into hyperspace. Once in transit, the boys reprogram and get to know the droid, and it helps them assess the damage. The hyperdrive generator is leaking fuel, so the only way to make it to the Republic capital would be to make a pit stop on nearby Tatooine for replacement parts. Once they've landed on the desert planet, Obi-Wan decides that they should keep a low profile, so he orders the boys to keep the Queen safe on the ship while he takes Owen, Anakin, and R2 into town to help them find the parts they'll need. And with a sandstorm brewing on the horizon, they'll need to hurry. Owen tells Anakin not to touch anything as they investigate the shop of a local junk dealer, who might be an alien creature but definitely isn't a floating CGI character. Anakin is fascinated by all the different parts in the shop, and Owen gets distracted flirting with the junk dealer's clerk, Beru, leaving Obi-Wan to haggle by himself. The Jedi tries to throw his weight around, making sure the alien shop owner can see his lightsaber, and he attempts another Jedi mind trick, but the dealer just scoffs at him. The Republic has no power out here, and its enforcers have no control over his mind. If they don't have any money to buy the parts, they're out of luck. Frustrated, Obi-Wan collects his companions, catching Owen in the middle of trying to impress Beru by spilling the beans about his super important secret mission for the Republic. When the group leaves the shop, the junk dealer asks his clerk what exactly the boy was talking about, and what he was doing with a Jedi, revealing that he managed to steal the lightsaber right off of Obi-Wan's belt. As the sandstorm picks up, Obi-Wan lectures Owen about keeping his mouth shut. He doesn't know who could be listening. Owen says it's not a big deal, nobody out here knows who they are. But his confidence evaporates when Obi-Wan tells him that Tatooine is under the control of gangs like the Hutts, vicious killers who would, in a best-case scenario, sell the Queen right back to the Trade Federation if they knew she was here. Owen asks why the Jedi didn't tell him this before they landed, and Obi-Wan says it's not like they had much choice, it was either here or nowhere. It's clear that Obi-Wan hasn't been thinking ahead and is just trying to retain his position of authority. An awkward pause in the argument gives Obi-Wan time to notice that R2 and Anakin are gone, and when he turns back, Owen is gone too. He calls out for them, but he can barely even see beyond his own hands in the sandstorm, and when he reaches for his lightsaber, even it's missing. Defenseless, gangster thugs rush him from the storm, and while he puts up a valiant fight, he's eventually overcome and knocked out. The sandstorm rages back at the ship too, with more alien gangsters emerging from the dust cloud. They pry open the landing hatch of the ship, and the Queen and the other boys are dragged out, screaming inaudibly over the wind of the storm. A sandstorm is featured briefly in the real Phantom Menace, being the reason for Qui-Gon and the others to visit Anakin's home, but a sequence much closer to this one actually originates in Return of the Jedi. While a sandstorm scene was filmed for and eventually cut from the movie, an extended sandstorm sequence was featured in the rough draft script, with Luke being captured during the storm and taken to Vader rather than voluntarily turning himself over later in the film. So, with Lucas including a sandstorm in the version of Episode 1 we got, and him wanting to feature a sandstorm in Return of the Jedi, I think it's appropriate to include one here too. Rather than being taken to a Sith Lord though, Obi-Wan finds himself brought before a local crimelord. And rather than Jabba, this crimelord is one of the Hutt's rivals, named Mantros. Mantros as a character name originates in the second draft of A New Hope, where he was one of several crew members of the pirate ship that would eventually become the Millennium Falcon. Jabba was another one of these crew members, so I think we can reuse Mantros' name in this context. So Mantros tells Obi-Wan that he's heard a Jedi was throwing his weight around in one of his junk shops and he wanted to see for himself, but he's not impressed. Obi-Wan assures Mantros that he is a Jedi, and that if the crime lord doesn't let him go, he'll find out just how impressive he can be. Mantros just scoffs and reveals that he's captured all of Obi-Wan's companions. He says that the Trade Federation would pay handsomely to get their missing queen back, and the boys seem to be able-bodied workers as well, but he's willing to return them to the Jedi's custody in exchange for a favor. Obi-Wan's skeptical, but asks what the favor is. Mantros tells him that there's a big speeder race coming up, and Jabba the Hutt had one of his goons take out Mantros' champion racer. He's heard stories about Jedi reflexes and demands that Obi-Wan race for him. If he wins, the prisoners go free and they can use their share of the winnings to buy parts for their ship. Obi-Wan reluctantly accepts the deal, but when Mantros shows him the vehicle, it's clear that it's in rough shape, and he only has until dawn to get the thing up and running again. But showing more interest in victory than cruelty, Mantros allows R2, the boys, and the Queen to help Obi-Wan fix the speeder using the junk dealer's parts, the cost of which will of course be subtracted from their winnings, if they win. So obviously the pod race was a big part of the Phantom Menace and a major computer-generated action sequence, but would it really exist in a movie from 1987? Not exactly, but I think something similar would. Before experiencing a car crash that would put him on the path to becoming a filmmaker, George Lucas wanted to be a race car driver. The drag racing sequence from American Graffiti was drawn from Lucas's own teenage experiences, and fixing and racing cars was his primary interest during his high school years. But while this influence is clear to see in Star Wars with its hot-rodded spaceships and high-speed chases, racing itself had never been a focal point until Episode 1. And I think that it still could be in our version of Episode 1, just modified a bit. Rather than a multi-lap circuit, the race might be more like a drag race with a single endpoint that the competitors are trying to reach. This is the type of racing that Lucas did in his youth, and it might be the type that he would think of first. It would also allow Lucas to realize the referenced but never seen Beggar's Canyon from A New Hope. A canyon race would also make the sequence possible to shoot in the mid-80s. When trying to figure out how to do the actual pod race, visual effects supervisor John Knoll considered things like location shooting and miniatures, but realized that undercranking helicopter footage to make it appear faster would result in a jittery mess, and the wide open plains and rock formations of Tatooine would be too difficult to pull off with miniatures at that scale. Miniatures were used, though, in the canyon and cave portions of the race, so I think that our 80s version of the sequence would stick to those locations that could be built physically, But this is Industrial Light and Magic we're talking about, and using a Star Wars movie to push the envelope of visual effects is expected. Tron's computer-generated light cycles appeared in 1982. The Last Starfighter made CGI starships in 1984. Young Sherlock Holmes had a photorealistic character in 1985, and 1986's Flight of the Navigator featured a reflection-mapped spaceship. Star Wars would have to do better than that. So I think that while the environments would be built physically, the vehicles in the race could be digital. That would allow them to move and behave in ways that standard motion control ships couldn't, and would allow for the character of the drivers to shine through. It would also allow ILM to make use of some of the techniques that were being developed at the time by Lucasfilm's computer graphics division, Pixar. In the real world, George Lucas had sold Pixar to Steve Jobs in 1986, partially as a way to keep his company afloat after the end of the Star Wars trilogy. But with our Lucas jumping right back into the Scrooge McDuck Star Wars money pool, he may not have felt that was necessary, and Pixar could have remained a part of Lucasfilm. So ultimately, we still have a speeder race, though not a pod race. The race sequence in the actual film is inspired by the chariot race in the 1959 film Ben-Hur, but I'm not sure that Lucas would have been necessarily thinking of that in this version of the movie. Beyond the race sequence, Ben-Hur also prominently features the enslavement of its title character. In the real Episode 1, Anakin is also a slave, so it makes sense that Lucas might have revisited Ben-Hur as a film that dealt with similar themes, with the movie also influencing the depiction of the pod race. But in our story, Anakin is from Aqual and isn't a slave, so there's less reason for Lucas to go back to Ben-Hur and its chariots. So during the speeder's repairs, Owen keeps getting distracted, talking to Beru in the shop, but Anakin notices Obi-Wan's purloined lightsaber stashed away behind the counter. Just as he grabs it, the junk dealer returns and angrily tells him to keep his hands where he can see them, though Anakin manages to stash the lightsaber in a toolbox before he notices. Owen apologizes for the kid's behavior and sends him back out to the junkyard. Before he can return the weapon to Obi-Wan, though, it's clear something's wrong. The Jedi seems distant and inattentive, so Breya takes him aside and he reveals a nasty wound that he suffered when being taken captive and has been keeping hidden to appear strong for the rest of the group. And as she dresses his injury, the young queen begins to realize that she's developing a crush on the dashing older Jedi. This is a little icky, but a pseudo-romance between the queen and Obi-Wan was actually part of Lucas's first draft of The Phantom Menace and only got cut later. This may have been because subsequent drafts gave most of Obi-Wan's scenes in the movie to Qui-Gon instead, so the queen and Obi-Wan didn't really have much time to interact. But because Qui-Gon doesn't exist in our version of the movie, Obi-Wan and Breya are able to spend more time together. And beyond just having the opportunity, Lucas also has a history of incorporating these kinds of age gap romances into his movies. There's obviously Anakin and Padme in the prequels, but during early story conferences for Indiana Jones, Lucas suggested that Indy and Marian's initial relationship occurred when she was no older than 15. American Graffiti also features an entire subplot based around a womanizing young adult slowly coming to enjoy the company of a 12-year-old girl. This sort of thing was also in the early drafts of A New Hope as well. I mentioned before that Leia was originally written to be 14 years old, and the rough draft script ends with her sharing a kiss with the 18-year-old Anakin Starkiller in the wake of the Death Star's destruction. In the third draft script, which was used for casting, Leia's age was raised to 16, but Han, who expresses romantic interest in her, was said to be 25. In the fourth draft, which was written after Carrie Fisher and Harrison Ford had been cast, only Han's age was changed, being raised to 30, while Leia remained 16 years old. So while it's not great, and it's good that it was cut out of the actual Episode 1, I don't think there's enough roadblocks in place to prevent Lucas from removing it from this version of the movie, and we get the 14-year-old Queen Breya crushing on the roughly 25-year-old Obi-Wan Kenobi. And while Obi-Wan definitely feels conflicted about the girl's attention, his larger concern is his physical health. It's becoming rapidly clear that he'll be in no position to race even if the speeder is up and running, so he'll need to find someone to replace him. Breya spills the beans despite Obi-Wan wanting to maintain his image as an invulnerable Jedi Knight, and while the boys are shocked and disappointed that they won't get to see him race, they're also excited to impress him, with several of the older boys boasting that they can easily win. But Obi-Wan chooses Anakin. He noticed the boy's piloting skills during the blockade run, and he believes that Anakin has an innate connection to the Force that would make him the ideal replacement. The other boys argue, with Owen especially trying to keep Anakin from doing something this dangerous, but Obi-Wan is still a Jedi, so they obey him and prepare Anakin as best they can as they finish the preparations for the race. When their busted speeder pulls up to the starting line near the entrance to Beggar's Canyon, the situation looks pretty grim. The other competitors are experienced racers and top-of-the-line speeders, while Obi-Wan's letting everything ride on a 10-year-old in a barely functional metal death trap. So while the Jedi gives the boy some parting words of wisdom about trusting the Force, the others just wish him good luck and head to the stands. As the race begins, Anakin struggles to even get the speeder moving, and Owen stares daggers at Obi-Wan. But inevitably, Anakin's speeder roars to life, and he races through the canyon using his scrappy cunning and what to all outside observers would seem like blind, dumb luck to barely scrape by with a victory. The boys are ecstatic, Obi-Wan and Breya are relieved, but Owen is just frustrated. So, while the other boys return to the ship with the new parts, Owen stays behind to have a private talk with Obi-Wan and Anakin. He calls out Obi-Wan for agreeing to the crimelord's challenge despite being injured and putting everyone's life in danger because he wanted to seem like a big, powerful Jedi. Obi-Wan defends himself. They wouldn't even be in this situation if Owen hadn't been so preoccupied with trying to impress a girl, and besides, the Force was with them. They won because they were destined to, and no other outcome was possible. Owen calls bullshit on that Jedi stuff, saying that it almost got all of them enslaved. He tells Obi-Wan that if there's more like that in store for them by following him, then he's going to stay on Tatooine. Owen tries to get Anakin to stay too, saying that Obi-Wan used him to fix his own mistake. But Anakin feels differently. He says that Owen never treated him like a real part of the Resistance, but Obi-Wan trusted and believed in him. Owen tries to say that he did believe in Anakin. The odds against him winning were so terrible that the meager bet Owen was able to place on him paid back 1,000-fold, and now he has enough money to start an entirely new life. Anakin just says that's the difference between Owen and the Jedi. Obi-Wan's trying to help people, but Owen's just looking out for himself. When coming up with the story for a movie, there's a lot of little puzzle pieces that have to fit together, and when dealing with a prequel, there are certain pieces that you have a responsibility to make sure fit somewhere. One of them is, how does Uncle Owen fit into everything? In the real prequels, he's Anakin's stepbrother, but because we took out the Gungans and replaced him with the Rebel Boys, and took out Jar Jar and replaced him with Anakin, there's no slavery, no Shmi, no way to get to that version of Owen. But because we do have those Rebel Boys, we have a very easy way to get a different version of Owen, and an opportunity to actually show the relationship and the friction between Owen, Anakin, and Obi-Wan that was alluded to in A New Hope, which I think could have been more of a priority if Episode 1 was made hot on the heels of those original movies, rather than allowing 20 years of hazy memories to make certain character relationships seem less important. So as Obi-Wan and Anakin return to the ship in the desert, the Jedi senses something and sees a shimmering shape on the horizon. At first it seems like a mirage, but then it becomes all too real as the speeder-mounted Sith Knight crests the ridge of a dune and attacks. Obi-Wan reaches for his lightsaber, but realizes he never got it back after it was stolen from him. Anakin sees what's happening too and runs back to the ship, where the others are finishing the repairs with R2. He alerts them to the fight, and Breya assertively leads the boys in getting the ship started as Anakin races to the toolbox, rummaging through it until he finds the lightsaber he stashed there. Returning to the ship's ramp, Anakin tosses the weapon to Obi-Wan, who ignites it and finally has a chance to fight back against his attacker. The ship's engines flare to life as the battle begins, kicking up sand and dust all around the combatants. The Sith is caught off guard, but Obi-Wan's experienced this before, and this time he's ready. Deftly navigating the miniature sandstorm, Obi-Wan leaps aboard the landing ramp of the ship as it takes off, and although his lingering injury prevents him from beating the Dark Warrior, he manages to escape unscathed once again. Once everyone is safe, Obi-Wan explains that Owen decided to stay behind, and tells the other boys that if they want, he can alter course to the city so they can join him. But the boys just saw a Jedi warrior fighting in a real-life lightsaber battle. They're disappointed that Owen isn't coming with them, but their loyalty to the Jedi and to their queen has only gotten stronger. So the stolen vessel then makes its way to the Republic capital, which has had a few different names over the years. In the rough draft of A New Hope, the Imperial city planet was called Alderaan. In early versions of The Empire Strikes Back, it was known as Ton Mund. And in the rough draft of Return of the Jedi, it was Had Abaddon. Its eventual permanent name, Coruscant, was created by author Timothy Zahn for his novel Heir to the Empire. And since that book wouldn't be published until 1991, we can assume the planet would have a different name in our prequels. I don't know if Lucas would necessarily use any of those older Imperial names, though. Alderaan is obviously spoken for, and this movie takes place before the Dark Times, so a name like Had Abaddon, which has a declamatory biblical origin, wouldn't make sense as the capital of the Republic, even if it's showing signs of corruption. Instead, I think we'll call the Republic capital Ofuchi. Ofuchi was the name of the safe planet the characters were trying to reach in A New Hope's early outline, and the name is a reference to Ophuchus, a real-world constellation that depicts a man grappling with a serpent, which is a good visual metaphor for the overall themes of the prequels. The planet itself could still have been depicted as an enormous city and probably would have been created using the same techniques as Bespin or Blade Runner's Los Angeles. When the group lands, Obi-Wan reunites with Mace as Breha meets with Aqual, Senator Palpatine, and the Republic President, not the Chancellor, since Lucas wasn't using that term in the 80s. And now we get to the politics. Star Wars has always been inherently political. A New Hope was based partially on George Lucas's thoughts about the Vietnam War, and his backstory for the Emperor during the making of Return of the Jedi explicitly named him as a Richard Nixon analog. In The Phantom Menace, the ousted Chancellor Valorum was based on a pre-impeachment Bill Clinton, so it's possible that our Republic President would also be based on the then most recent Democrat in office, Jimmy Carter. For my fellow Canadians and other non-Americans in the audience, the short version is that Jimmy Carter was the President of the United States from 1977 to 1981, and he was seen as a nice enough person, but a fairly weak and indecisive leader. His handling of a hostage crisis in Iran during his presidency was particularly controversial, and it was a large point of contention during the 1980 presidential election that resulted in Ronald Reagan taking office. A decade later, in 1991, an editorial column in the New York Times would suggest that Reagan's campaign actually conspired with Iran to delay the release of the hostages until after the November election, to prevent Carter from using it to boost his chances of winning at the last minute. And indeed, the hostages were finally released minutes after Reagan's inauguration. This October surprise theory was investigated for a few years after the 1991 article by journalists and the US government, and as late as 2023, people were still adding fuel to the fire. But all that speculation happened well after our version of Episode 1 would have been released in 1987, so why mention it? Well, because the prequels were surprisingly prescient about future political events. And while Episode 1's Clinton-inspired Chancellor Valorum being ousted from office was seen by audiences a few months after Clinton's own impeachment in 1999, the movie was filmed in 1997, several months before the story of the scandal that would lead to the impeachment had even broken. Something similar happened in Episode 2. The movie was released in 2002, but filmed in the year 2000, and just so happened to feature a terrorist attack in Space New York with the search for the culprit being used to justify starting a war in the desert with a completely different person based on the alleged discovery of weapons of mass destruction. So I think it would be appropriate to give our prequels some of the same prescience. Despite the mental gymnastics required to end up with a 14-year-old democratically elected queen, George Lucas made some pretty politically astute children's movies, and it makes sense to honor the stuff that he got right. So, in our Episode 1, President Valorum, who can keep his name since it originates with the character from A New Hope's rough draft, is an affable Jimmy Carter type whose handling of the crisis on Aqual is being manipulated by the charismatic Senator Palpatine, who's part Richard Nixon and part Ronald Reagan. Valorum is initially resistant to the idea of Breha pleading her case directly to the Senate. After all, there are proper procedures for this sort of thing, and she can't circumvent the Republic's bureaucracy just because she wants her problems fixed before everyone else's. Palpatine asks Obi-Wan suggestively if there's nothing he can do to help change Valorum's mind. So Obi-Wan subtly convinces Valorum that Breha addressing the Senate as soon as possible would actually be a very good idea. Or at least we think that's what happens. Someone certainly gets Valorum to change his mind, but Obi-Wan's not so good at that yet, is he? Regardless, an emergency session of the Senate is called, and Breha demands the Republic take action to deliver her planet from the hands of the Trade Federation. Palpatine goes even further and calls for Valorum's impeachment, accusing him of being either unable or unwilling to bypass the bureaucracy that's preventing worlds like Aqual from getting the help they desperately need, and even intimating that Valorum might be stalling because he's been bought off by the Trade Federation's money. Palpatine also cautions that if Valorum isn't strong enough to deal with the Trade Federation, how could he possibly protect the Republic from the looming threat of the Confederacy of Independent Systems? One of the things that we haven't taken into account yet is that this movie would be made during the Cold War. The Russians were the big villains of 1980s America, and with the original trilogy tackling the Vietnam War, I don't think the political climate of the 80s would have been left out of the prequels if they'd been made earlier. So, the Confederacy of Independent Systems, for this film at least, will act as a sort of boogeyman that the Republic is afraid of. And while in real life the Confederacy debuted in Attack of the Clones, I think that the Cold War atmosphere that the movie would be made in could lead to them getting an early mention, which I think we can justify because they first got name-dropped in 1973. Going all the way back to Lucas's Journal of the Wills writing exercise, the Alliance of Independent Systems served as a rival to the Empire, with the Jedi warlord Mace Windu being among their members. Eventually, this alliance evolved into the Rebel Alliance, but the Independent Systems name would return for the prequels, now becoming Confederates to make sure the audience reads them as villains. So while Brea and Palpatine try to stir the Senate into action, Obi-Wan has a chance to catch up with Mace, and only Mace. When George Lucas was writing Return of the Jedi, he determined that Yoda wasn't actually a Jedi. He was a sort of guru that the Jedi went to for teaching. And in a Q&A session at an early fan convention in 1987, he even suggested that Darth Vader and the Emperor had no idea he even existed.
Maybe they don't know any about it.
What this says to me is that while the Jedi could certainly exist in great numbers in this early version of the prequels, the idea of Yoda being the leader of a Jedi council hadn't yet been developed, and that Jedi training at the time might have been more similar to what Luke went through on Dagobah than the classroom setting we see in Attack of the Clones. Yoda could be mentioned, of course. Obi-Wan would tell Mace about Anakin's burgeoning power in the Force, and when Mace asks if he's going to take the boy to Yoda for training, Obi-Wan would say no. He's going to do it himself. He's formed a rapport with the boy, and with the confidence that he's gained as the leader of this ragtag band of misfits, he feels that he's ready to take on an apprentice of his own. And while we're talking about the Force, there would also be no mention of midi-chlorians. George Lucas invented them for Episode 1 as a way to reinforce the movie's themes about symbiotic relationships, primarily demonstrated with the Gungans and the humans of Naboo needing to help each other in order to drive the Trade Federation off their planet. And because there's no Gungans in this version of the movie, that theme isn't being explored, so we don't really need midi-chlorians. Anakin might still have been the chosen one, though. Prophecies have been a part of Star Wars since the second draft of A New Hope, which opens with a prophetic quote from the Journal of the Wills. And in early ideas for The Empire Strikes Back, Luke was depicted as having been chosen by the Force to become its physical manifestation, with the good and evil sides waging a metaphysical war for his soul. But those are both prophecies about Luke, who's the hero of the story. Or he was the hero of the story. See, when George Lucas made the prequels in real life, they had to be part of one continuous story with the movies that already existed. And it wouldn't make sense for that story to change its main character halfway through, so Lucas decided that it didn't, that we only thought Luke was the main character because we missed the first 3 episodes, and that the real story is the story of Darth Vader. And one way to make it instantly clear to the audience that this recontextualization is happening, that Anakin Skywalker is the guy we're supposed to be following all along, is to make him the subject of a chosen one prophecy. So Mace and Obi-Wan discussed this possibility, with Obi-Wan noting that the appearance of a Sith Knight on a mission that led to Obi-Wan meeting Anakin is a curious coincidence. Mace reminds him that there's no such thing as coincidence, and advises caution. He even pledges to help Obi-Wan complete his mission, since he regrets having to retreat on the station and feels that if the Sith Knight managed to track the Queen to Tatooine, it's likely that he'll remain close behind. The Sith being a thing, rather than some long-forgotten ancient enemy, is something that I think we can pull from the early drafts of A New Hope. Back then, the idea for the Sith was that they were a clan of pirates who had been taught the ways of the dark side and became the personal bodyguards of the Emperor, making them more similar to the Knights of Ren than the secretive Sith Order seen in the actual prequels. And I think with this version of the movie being made hot on the heels of Return of the Jedi, Lucas wouldn't have had as much time to devise a totally new backstory for the Sith, so we can use a version of them that are closer to the early mercenary pirate depiction, though still a rare and dangerous foe. But just then, Palpatine strides out of the Senate chamber with Queen Brea storming behind him. And although she's frustrated with the Republic's refusal to send aid to her planet, the incident has caused enough controversy for Valorum to be ousted from office, with a snap election being called to determine the next Republic president. So with no additional help, Brea decides to return home and solve the problem herself. As Mace preps the stolen ship for takeoff, Brea and Obi-Wan brief the boys on the plan. The Jedi and the Queen will head down to the surface to retake the palace from the Shatnerian Viceroy, while the boys use the stolen shuttle to sneak aboard the droid control ship and shut down their army. Easy, right? Back on Aqual, the Viceroy is enjoying his spoils in the throne room, eagerly devouring the finest food in the palace as the Queen's golden protocol droid uselessly lectures him about using the incorrect utensils, if he bothers to use them at all. The feast is interrupted by the arrival of the Sith Knight, who tells the Viceroy that the Queen is returning to her home and that she's coming for his head. The Shatnerian is worried until he learns that she's coming without the Republic's aid, and he returns to his gluttony, telling the Sith to deal with the situation in whatever way he deems fit. Coming out of hyperspace well beyond the blockade, the gang sets their plan into motion. The boys turn off all the ship's systems and let it drift towards the Federation's blockade, while the Queen and the Jedi climb into the escape pod. The pod launches, and like its stolen mothership, its systems remain deactivated as it whirls through the darkness towards the planet. Aboard one of the Federation vessels, a droid picks up the powered-down hunks of metal on its scopes and determines that the stolen ship must have malfunctioned. They tow the vessel into an immense hangar and allow the seemingly defunct escape pod to pass through the blockade unharmed. This plan of shutting off a ship's systems and being towed into an enemy hangar bay as salvage is actually how the Millennium Falcon infiltrated the Imperial prison in the early drafts of A New Hope, and I think it works to reuse it here. As the escape pod enters the planet's atmosphere, its occupants restart its systems and its engines flare to life, lowering it gently to the surface. Back in the hangar, the boys lie in wait aboard the ship, and when the droids force their way inside, they charge, overwhelming the two security robots and stealing their weapons to raid the hangar. After blasting the other security droids, the boys realize they're in the wrong place, because the control ship is visible outside in space. But then they notice a squadron of starfighters parked in the bay, and the boys realize what they have to do. The starfighters are built for two, with an astromech socket alongside the traditional pilot seat, and after breaking off the astro droid's restraining bolts, the robots are more than happy to help the boys with whatever it is they're doing. R2 joins Anakin in his starfighter, and the group blasts off out of the hangar. This idea of stealing enemy starfighters to attack their battle station is actually something that originates in the early Star Wars story synopsis, and it also made its way into the rough draft script, though by that time the boys had been replaced in the story by a tribe of Wookiees. Meanwhile, down on the planet, the Jedi and the Queen have to fight their way through the battle droids guarding the palace, making progress towards the throne room until they're cut off by the sudden appearance of the Sith Knight, who's ready for his rematch against the two Jedi. The battle begins above the planet as well, and the rebel boys have the time of their lives flying in combat against the droid pilots of the Trade Federation, whose robotic brains are confused by the boys' erratic flying style. All seems to be going well until the Federation reasserts control of the astromechs to stall out the fighters, leaving only Anakin and the fully reprogrammed R2-D2 still able to fly. Things are also starting to go poorly in the palace. The Jedi have their hands full trying to keep the Sith away from the Queen, who keeps trying to rush the throne room rather than staying somewhere safe. When she finally does manage to break away, she's met by a group of battle droids and a shield that protects the throne room. The third act up until this point has been broadly similar to what actually ended up in the movie, with the Queen trying to reach the Viceroy in the throne room, while the Jedi duel the Sith, and the space battle up above tries to destroy the droid control ship. But we do have a few new elements. The first is the Trade Federation disabling the stolen fighters by asserting control of the astromechs. This doesn't come from any old notes or discussions from George Lucas, but I think it's appropriate for the way this version of the story has evolved. It's fairly standard in movies like this for the heroes to only claim victory after it looks like they're going to lose everything. In A New Hope, Luke can only make the shot on the Death Star once R2's been shot and Vader is on his tail. In Return of the Jedi, the Ewoks can only save the day once the Empire has overwhelmed the rebels. And in the actual Episode 1, the Queen and the Gungans need to be beaten by the droids, Anakin's starfighter needs to be vulnerable inside the Trade Federation hangar, and Qui-Gon needs to die before any of the heroes can claim a victory. So in our version, that cascade of failure begins with the Trade Federation reasserting control of the rogue droids. The shield that prevents access to the throne room is also a new element for the story, but shields are oddly prominent in the actual Phantom Menace, so I think that at least one plot-important shield could have found its way into the movie even if it were made earlier. The shield also allows us to set up the next stage of the conflict. Over the din of combat, Breya shouts to the Jedi to head to the generator room and shut it down to break the lockdown, but it's clear that she's no match for the droids. Obi-Wan breaks away to save her, telling Mace to deal with the generator while he helps Breya fend off the robots. Mace and the Sith Lord fight their way to the generator as more and more droids pour in around the throne room, eventually overwhelming the Queen and her protector. By himself, Mace can't keep up with the Sith warrior, and he leaps up to a high platform in the generator room to put some space between himself and his enemy. The Sith taunts him. Mace is old, and his powers are weak. His death is inevitable. Mace agrees, and drives his lightsaber straight into the generator. An explosion rocks the palace as droids surround Obi-Wan and the Queen. The lights go out, ending the lockdown, but as the palace is bathed in the red glow of emergency lamps, he realizes what happened, and that it's his fault. So, just like with Qui-Gon, Obi-Wan's older Jedi mentor perishes at the hands of the Sith. But because this version of the story is putting so much more focus on Obi-Wan and his choices, I think it's appropriate to make that death his responsibility. In the original trilogy, Obi-Wan's decision to train Anakin was implied to be the result of hubris and ego. In the prequels, it turned out that he only did it out of obligation, but that's the version of the story where Qui-Gon took all of Obi-Wan's scenes. I think in a version without Qui-Gon, that earlier motivation for training Anakin could have remained consistent throughout the saga, and we can demonstrate it here. When giving a choice between saving a mentor and saving a girl with a crush, Obi-Wan chooses the one who validates him. But who's going to save the boys? With their ships inoperable, the enemy starfighters begin their attack run to eliminate their easy prey. Anakin is scared, but rather than paralyzing him, his fear turns to anger, and that anger gives him the push he needs to slam the throttle of the ship and blast right through the squadron of incoming fighters as R2 screams in the socket behind him. Anakin's maneuver is enough to draw the enemy fighters away from the defenseless rebel boys, and with R2's help, he makes a suicidal run into the hangar bay of the droid control ship. Programmed to destroy their foes at all costs, the droid pilots follow him, blasting heedlessly in a vain attempt to hit the deranged child's ship, and destroying their own vessel from within. The droid starfighters still out in space go spiraling madly through the void as they lose the ability to steer their craft, and the larger droid-controlled Star Destroyers collide with each other as their pilots go offline. In the palace, the droids surrounding Obi-Wan and Breya fall silent as well, not firing at them, not doing anything. Obi-Wan cautiously pushes one over and then looks back at Breya. Anakin did it. And what Anakin did is also pretty different from how it played out in the actual film. Because we don't have Anakin's mother in this version of the story, we don't yet have a moment where he really has to face losing the people he cares about. Owen chose to stay behind on Tatooine, but we know he's going to be fine. He's not being left to a life of slavery. So instead, we can have that moment here, when faced with the imminent death of his friends, the spark of something darker ignites inside of him and pushes him forward. Back in the palace, Breya is easily able to capture the sickly Trade Federation viceroy, and her golden protocol droid C-3PO is ecstatic at her return. Obi-Wan, however, isn't as pleased. He finds Mace's charred body in the generator room, but sees no trace of the Sith Knight that he was fighting. The dour mood is continued at Mace's funeral. Among those visiting Aqual to pay their respects is Yoda, who expresses concern to Obi-Wan about his readiness to take on an apprentice, and worry about the Sith's involvement in the situation. Nevertheless, the problem seems to have been solved for now, and the heroes of Aqual are honored with a massive celebration, and Anakin is set to begin an eventful career as a Jedi Knight. Iris out to credits. And that's it. That's maybe what The Phantom Menace could have been like if it had been made 12 years earlier. Would that have been better? Maybe the lack of digital technology and proximity to the other films would have kept some of the more controversial elements of the real movie from hitting the screen, but if people didn't like 10-year-old Anakin before, I don't think they would have responded well to just having the Goonies show up as major characters, and the blossoming romance between the Queen and Obi-Wan would have aged terribly, even if it wasn't really developed that much. People might also think that the Sith villain was just a less interesting retread of Darth Vader, and that the Shatnerians weren't intimidating villains at all. And they probably still would have been bored by the politics. I think that if this movie came out, audiences would have started to get tired of Star Wars, and the brand might have even fizzled out before the special editions even had a chance to exist. But if Lucas had done Episode 1 back then, regardless of how it was received or how much money it made, he'd be obligated to make 2 more films. But that's a story for another time.